The clash of steel against steel echoes across the battlefield. The screams of the wounded pierce through the morning air. Blood soaks into the earth beneath thousands of fallen warriors. But as the dust settles and the enemy retreats, a chilling question emerges from the carnage. What happens next? What becomes of a Roman legionary whose body is shattered, whose sword arm hangs useless, whose life hangs by the thinnest thread? You might think you know the answer. Perhaps you imagine these broken soldiers were simply left to die where they fell, abandoned by their comrades in the brutal reality of ancient warfare. Or maybe you picture them being carted off to some primitive medical tent where they'd either recover quickly or perish in agony. But the truth is far more complex, far more ingenious, and in many ways, far more brutal than anything you could imagine. The Roman Empire didn't conquer half the known world through luck or superior numbers alone. No, their dominance came from something much more calculating, much more systematic. They understood that every wounded soldier represented years of training, countless hours of drilling, and invaluable combat experience. To simply discard these men would be like throwing away perfectly good weapons. So they developed something unprecedented in the ancient world. A system so advanced, so methodical, that it wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Today, we're going to uncover the shocking reality of what happened when a Roman legionary fell in battle. We'll explore the desperate race against time that began the moment a soldier hit the ground bleeding. We'll witness the brutal decisions that determined who lived and who died. And we'll discover how Rome turned the aftermath of battle into yet another weapon of conquest. But I have to warn you, this isn't a story of noble sacrifice and heroic medicine. This is a tale of cold calculation, where human lives were weighed like grain in a merchant's scale, where mercy and pragmatism danced a deadly waltz across blood-soaked fields, where survival often depended not on the severity of your wounds, but on your value to the war machine. So brace yourself, because we're about to step into a world where the line between salvation and abandonment was razor thin, and where the choices made in those crucial moments after battle would echo through the corridors of history itself. The first few minutes after any Roman battle were absolute chaos. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men scattered across a field that just moments before had been a perfectly organized military formation. Some lie motionless, their stories already ended. Others writhe in agony, calling out for their mothers, their gods, or simply for water. The air is thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic scent of fresh blood. But here's where Rome showed its genius. While other armies of the ancient world would simply celebrate victory or mourn defeat, the Romans had already set their next phase in motion, because they understood something that their enemies didn't. The battle wasn't truly over until every wounded man had been accounted for. You see, scattered among the fallen were the capsari. These weren't doctors or medics as we understand them today. They were specially trained soldiers whose sole responsibility was the immediate aftermath of combat. Think of them as the world's first battlefield paramedics, but operating under conditions that would make modern emergency responders weep. Each capsarius carried a distinctive kit: a leather satchel filled with strips of linen for bandages, small bronze implements for extracting arrowheads, and most importantly, a supply of acetum. This wasn't wine meant for celebration. This was sour wine, vinegar, the Roman Empire's secret weapon against infection. They had discovered, purely through trial and error, that wounds washed with this acidic liquid healed better than those left untreated. But here's the brutal reality that Hollywood never shows you. These men didn't have time to save everyone. They couldn't even try. Instead, they had to make split-second decisions that would haunt any modern medical professional. Decisions based not on medical ethics, but on military value. The first priority was always the centurions and standard bearers. These were the backbone of Roman military structure, the men whose leadership and experience could not be easily replaced. A wounded centurion would be carried to safety, even if it meant stepping over a dozen dying legionaries. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was the cold mathematics of empire. Next came the veterans, the grizzled soldiers who had survived multiple campaigns. Their knowledge of tactics, their ability to steady younger troops in future battles, made them worth saving. These men carried the institutional memory of the legion. Lose too many veterans, and you'd have to rebuild not just numbers, but expertise. Finally, if time and resources permitted, came the younger soldiers. But even here, brutal choices had to be made. A man with a sword wound to the arm might be saved. A soldier with a spear through the belly would likely be left to die, not out of callousness, but because the Capsari knew that such wounds were almost always fatal, and the time spent on hopeless cases could mean the death of men who might actually survive. This triage system was revolutionary for its time. Most armies simply left their wounded where they fell, assuming that fate or the gods would determine who lived and who died. But Rome had turned even suffering into a tool of military efficiency. The Capsari worked with methodical precision. They would quickly assess each wounded man, checking for signs of arterial bleeding, examining wounds for depth and location, and making their grim calculations. Those deemed worth saving received immediate first aid. A leather tourniquet here, a vinegar-soaked bandage there, perhaps a dose of poppy extract if the pain was too severe for the man to be moved. But what happened next was perhaps even more remarkable than this battlefield triage, because Rome had created something that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. A systematic evacuation process that could move hundreds of wounded men from the site of battle to places where they might actually have a chance of survival. The walking wounded, those who could still move under their own power, were formed into groups and directed toward predetermined rally points. These men, despite their injuries, were expected to help carry equipment and assist their more seriously wounded comrades. Remember, this was an army where discipline extended even to the aftermath of battle. The more seriously wounded were loaded onto improvised stretchers. But here's something that might surprise you. These weren't always purpose-built medical equipment. More often than not, Roman soldiers used their own shields as stretchers. The same scutum that had protected them in battle now became the vessel that might carry them to safety. 4 men would take the corners of a shield, place the wounded soldier on top, and begin the grueling march back to the legion's base camp. This wasn't a smooth ambulance ride. This was a jarring, agonizing journey over rough terrain, often taking hours, with each step sending fresh waves of pain through already traumatized bodies. But perhaps most remarkably of all, this evacuation wasn't left to chance or goodwill. It was mandated by military law. Roman soldiers were legally obligated to attempt the rescue of their wounded comrades. Failure to do so could result in severe punishment, including decimation, where every 10th man in a unit would be executed by his fellows. This created a culture where abandoning the wounded wasn't just morally wrong, it was militarily and legally unacceptable. Every legionary knew that if he fell in battle, his brothers in arms would risk their own lives to bring him home. This knowledge bred a fierce loyalty and courage that became legendary throughout the ancient world. Yet even as we admire this system, we must remember the harsh realities that governed every decision. Not every wounded man would make it to the base camp. Some would die during the evacuation itself, their injuries too severe to survive the journey. Others would succumb to shock or blood loss, despite the best efforts of their rescuers. And for those who did survive the evacuation, their ordeal was far from over, because what awaited them at the base camp would determine not just whether they lived or died, but what kind of life they might have if they survived. The base camp that greeted these battered survivors was unlike anything else in the ancient world. While most armies of the time treated their wounded as a burden to be endured, the Romans had constructed what can only be described as the world's first military hospitals. These weren't crude field tents with straw beds. These were sophisticated medical facilities called valetudinaria, purpose-built structures that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about battlefield medicine. Picture walking into one of these facilities. The first thing that would strike you wouldn't be the sight, but the sound. Not the screams you might expect, but an almost eerie quiet. Roman military medicine had discovered the power of organization and routine in treating trauma. Wounded soldiers were processed with the same methodical efficiency that characterized every other aspect of Roman military life. The facility was divided into distinct sections, each serving a specific purpose in this medical machine. The most seriously wounded were taken to the immediate care area, where the medici, trained military doctors, would make their own brutal assessments. These weren't physician-philosophers debating medical theory. These were practical men who had learned their trade in the crucible of war, and they knew that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Roman approach to battlefield medicine was revolutionary in ways that might shock you. They had developed surgical techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the Renaissance. They could remove arrowheads embedded deep in bone, amputate limbs with surprising precision, and even perform rudimentary brain surgery to relieve pressure from head wounds. All of this without any understanding of germs or modern anesthesia. But here's what made their system truly remarkable. They had figured out, through pure observation and experimentation, many of the principles that modern medicine takes for granted. They knew that keeping wounds clean prevented infection, even if they didn't understand why. They knew that certain herbs could dull pain or reduce fever. They had even developed a primitive form of anesthesia using combinations of opium, mandrake, and wine. The most skilled of these military doctors were often Greek slaves or freedmen, men whose medical knowledge had been honed in the great learning centers of Alexandria or Athens. But their theoretical knowledge was tempered by brutal practical experience. They had to work fast, with limited resources, knowing that their decisions would determine not just individual fates, but the future strength of the entire legion. Yet for all their skill, the Medici faced limitations that would be unimaginable today. Infection was still a mysterious killer that could claim a man days or weeks after his wounds had apparently healed. Blood loss that modern doctors could easily treat with transfusions was often a death sentence. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, wounds that damaged the spine or major organs were almost always fatal, no matter how skilled the treatment. This is where the Roman system revealed its most calculating aspect. The Medici didn't just treat patients, they categorized them. Soldiers were divided into groups based not just on their medical condition, but on their potential value to the army. A young legionary with a minor wound might receive the same basic care as a veteran with more serious injuries, but the veteran would get priority access to the limited supplies of expensive medicines and the attention of the most skilled doctors. Those deemed likely to make a full recovery were placed in one section of the valetudinarium. They would receive good food, clean bedding, and regular medical attention. But they were also expected to return to active duty as soon as possible. Roman medicine wasn't about comfort or extended recovery time. It was about getting soldiers back into fighting condition as quickly as possible. The partially disabled presented a more complex challenge. A soldier who lost a hand or suffered a severe leg wound might never fight in the front ranks again. But that didn't make him worthless to the war machine. The Romans had developed an entire system for utilizing these men in support roles. They might become trainers for new recruits, administrators in the camp, or specialists in siege warfare, where their experience was more valuable than their physical condition. But perhaps the most tragic category were those whose wounds were too severe for recovery, but not severe enough to grant them a quick death. Men blinded in battle, soldiers whose wounds had become infected and gangrenous, legionaries whose minds had been broken by traumatic brain injuries. These men existed in a grey area of Roman military medicine, receiving basic care but knowing that their usefulness to the empire had effectively ended. The psychological aspect of Roman battlefield medicine was as sophisticated as the physical treatment. The Medici understood that a man's will to live could be as important as the severity of his wounds. They developed techniques for maintaining morale among the wounded that were centuries ahead of their time. Wounded soldiers were not isolated from their comrades. Instead, they were kept in contact with their units, receiving regular visits from fellow legionaries who would bring news from the campaign and reassurance that their sacrifices were remembered and valued. This wasn't mere kindness. It was a calculated strategy to prevent the despair that could turn a survivable wound into a fatal one. The Romans had also discovered the power of purpose in healing. Wounded soldiers were given tasks appropriate to their condition, keeping their minds occupied and giving them a sense that they were still contributing to the war effort. A man with a broken arm might help maintain weapons. A soldier recovering from a leg wound might assist in training exercises. This kept them connected to their identity as warriors even when they couldn't fight. Yet underneath all of this systematic care lay a darker truth. The Roman military medical system, for all its innovations, was ultimately about preserving military assets, not saving lives for their own sake. Every decision, every treatment, every resource allocation was made with one question in mind. How does this serve the needs of the empire? This cold calculation extended even to the question of who would pay for treatment. Soldiers didn't receive free medical care out of imperial generosity. The cost of their treatment was deducted from their military pay, creating a system where recovery literally came at a price. Men who couldn't afford extended treatment might find themselves discharged from the army while still partially disabled, left to make their own way in a world that had little use for broken soldiers. The most fortunate of the wounded were those whose injuries, while serious, didn't prevent them from eventually returning to active duty. These men would undergo what we might recognize today as physical rehabilitation, though the Roman approach was typically more brutal and less forgiving than modern methods. Soldiers recovering from broken bones were expected to begin moving as soon as the Medici determined it was physically possible, often enduring excruciating pain in the name of preventing permanent weakness. Those with sword cuts or spear wounds had to demonstrate their ability to hold a weapon and maintain formation before they could be cleared for duty. There was no concept of taking time to fully heal, no consideration for lingering pain or reduced mobility. The rehabilitation process was as much about proving psychological readiness as physical capability. A legionary who showed signs of battlefield trauma, who flinched at the sound of clashing weapons, or seemed reluctant to engage in combat drills, might find himself reclassified as unfit for service, regardless of how well his wounds had healed. The Romans understood that fear was as contagious as disease, and they couldn't afford to have hesitant soldiers undermining the confidence of their units. But what happened to those who couldn't make this journey back to active duty? This is where the Roman system revealed both its pragmatic brilliance and its callous disregard for individual suffering. Because Rome had developed something that wouldn't be seen again for centuries, a comprehensive system for dealing with permanently disabled veterans. So there you have it, the brutal truth behind Rome's treatment of wounded soldiers. A system built not on compassion, but on cold military calculation, where a man's worth was measured not by his sacrifice, but by his future usefulness to the empire. This wasn't mercy. This was the machinery of conquest, turning even human suffering into another tool of dominance. The next time you see a Roman legion marching in a movie, remember the broken men left in their wake.